Hi, class. We're going to be talking today about West and Central Asian art. Um, we talked about Islamic art last week, and when we move on to this area, geographically speaking, we're going to be really thinking and referring back a lot to what we talked about last week with Islamic art. But the area we're going to be talking about was very cosmopolitan in the sense that it was this area with a lot of different influence happening. So the region that we're talking about in West and Central Asia is really this meeting place of Western and Eastern cultures coming together. This area that we're going to be talking about is also very much important in terms of trade and networks between the East and the West. So not only is this area really between influences from the West and the East, but also there's a lot of traveling happening in these areas. So we have a lot of ideas, a lot of influence, a lot of different styles coming together. Excuse me. So when I say West and Central Asian art, this is like kind of roughly defined as these areas, excuse me, that are very different from modern borders, but we're mostly going to focus on these areas that were influenced and dominated by Islam with interactions and influence from Buddhism as well as Hellenistic traditions and influence. When I say Hellenistic, I mean like Greek and Byzantine influences. So we're going to see the areas that we're going to focus on are predominantly ruled by Islamic rulers, minus talking about India a little bit, which is mostly going to be dominated by like Hinduism and Buddhism, which we will be talking about the next couple of weeks. But we're going to be seeing, again, a lot of Islamic influence, a lot of ideas coming from Islam and Islamic styles with influences from other areas. So again, we're going to talk about Buddhism a little bit later, and this is going to emerge in Southeast Asia, and then it's going to mostly go eastward, but we are going to obviously see influences in what we're talking about in the West. So we're going to be talking about textiles, metalwork, book illumination, and ceramics. Those are some of the mediums we're going to be talking about. And, you know, we're going to be looking at some objects that we might consider religious in the sense that it's serving some sort of religious purpose, architecture that has relationship to spirituality or religion. We're going to be looking at like a page from the Quran. So obviously that has a religious significance, but some of the examples we're going to be looking at are not necessarily Islamic, even though you're clearly going to see Islamic influence in terms of style. So let's get into it. All right, let's do a quick refresher of elements of Islamic art so that when we move forward, we're going to hopefully see things that you recognize from last week or our last discussion of Islamic art. So again, Islam started as a religion based in Saudi Arabia with the rise of the teachings of Muhammad around the 600s, and then spread across the Silk Road, so westward towards Europe and then east into parts of Asia. Lots of influence in Spain, which we talked about before, and then now we're going to be focusing more on the Middle East and then parts of Asia. So Islamic dynasties known as caliphates expanded their influence into the Mediterranean as well as North Africa and Asia. And then around the 1200s, with the invasion of the Mongols, you have this split between these Islamic empires, I guess we'll call them, with separate cultural traditions. We're not going to spend too much time talking about that. We're going to focus more on what happens before that. So because there's such a variety of what we're talking about, when we talk about Islamic art, that's going to include Islamic artists, Islamic patrons, people who are buying Islamic art, people who are building Islamic structures, but we're still going to see a lot of examples of Islamic art styles in non-Islamic contexts. So even if we call it Islamic art, it might not necessarily be serving some sort of religious purpose. It's just geographically, it's going to play an important role in what we're looking at. So again, one of the things we emphasized a lot when we talk about Islamic art is an emphasis on geometric patterning and non-figural designs, because again, secular objects excuse me, religious objects and depictions of humans and God and spiritual figures was completely strictly forbidden. And so, generally speaking, we're going to see a big emphasis on abstract patterns and geometry. Calligraphy is really important, calligraphy being the artful design of words. So, we're going to look at some examples of that. So most Islamic art objects that we're going to look at are from wealthy patrons, and these are produced locally and abroad and like traveled a lot. We're going to see a lot of different types of patterns. Again, emphasis on geometric designs, emphasis on non-figural design, and we're going to see these things in tile work, textile, ceramics. Some of the types of patterns we're going to see or designs that we're going to see include arabesques. Arabesques, I like when I think of an arabesque, I think of things that are often more organic in shape or more organic forms, but still some sort of patterning. So you could see like leaves, zigzag spirals. They could be like vegetal patterns, things like that. Calligraphy, like I said, calligraphy is associated with artful design of like text. And then tessellations are when you see interlocking patterns. You're actually going to do an activity this week for your assignment where you're going to create your own tessellated pattern, which will be fun. And basically a pattern that has no gaps between it. So think like a hound's tooth pattern. That's something that's very common you see in like contemporary like fashion and stuff like that. Very mathematical, highly organized. These things are not just patterns that are, meant to be artful just for the sake of being artful, but actually reflect a sense of order and geometry, reflective of the natural world. So it's sort of a way of honoring the unity and organization of God's designs. If you think from the perspective of like a Muslim thinking about making a pattern as honoring God, excuse me, but without creating a narrative or a figure of him. And we're going to see examples of mosques, which is basically an Islamic church. And again, we've talked about this idea that these structures were always typically faced in the direction of Mecca, which is the holiest site of Islam. All right, our first object we're going to focus on is a folio from a Quran. So basically, this is going to be pages from a Quran. And the Quran in Islamic tradition is considered the most important text, holy text. The Quran, the word Quran literally translates to recitation. So it's believed that much of the writing in the Quran is directly from the words of Muhammad when he was leader, when he was alive. This particular folio that we find is coming from North Africa and has Arab influences. So obviously Arab because this is when Islam is forming as a religion. So 600s is when Muhammad was alive. This is from 700 to about 800. So this is relatively early in influence developing for Islam. It's one of the earliest surviving Quran, and that's always going to be important because it gives us a sense of what standards are being established and what ends up taking root and becoming the style that it gets established over time. So you'll notice that we have it's I really should have put an image here of comparing this to like an illuminated manuscript from Christianity because you'll notice a lot of differences and showing and similarities as well, right? Because there's these holy texts and you can see how they go about it differently. It was very common in Christian Bibles, for example, to have images associated as a way of being didactic, teaching about the story. While also having artful depictions of some of the lettering, but mostly the text itself is done pretty standardized. Whereas you'll notice here we don't have images, we don't have narrative scenes because that is forbidden. However, we have a very much more ornamental and much more design went into the script and the text of what we're looking at here. So you see that the text itself is actually written in Kufic script. Kufic is a type of script that has very strong vertical lines and then long horizontal. If you compare this to other Quranic texts, you'll see that over time calligraphy becomes even more ornamental and more designed and more complicated and those things are quite beautiful, but in terms of reading become really difficult to read. Kufic specifically was designed to be highly legible, something that could be read easily. Um, so when you think about something like this, if you have something that has these really large text blocks and very legible, it means that it was something that was meant to be read potentially by several readers at one time as opposed to like one person looking at this. So there's also an interesting development of the size of the text, giving you an indication of what is considered important. I mean, this might seem like kind of small things, but when you really think about it, if you're putting together a book and if you make certain words or text bolded or bigger or smaller, that's going to influence how you read it and what elements are important. So this is not just about design, but it's also about theological interpretation, right? Like if you're emphasizing something, if you're emphasizing a certain word, you are telling your reader that theologically speaking, that is more important than something else, right? So you have to think about those things and those choices that are being made early on. Um, this one in particular, this text that we're looking at, you'll notice that we have the script in black. You'll also see that there's these red dots as well. Those are actually the vowels, and the black script is the consonants of the words. You'll also notice it's hard to tell, but if you spend a minute, you'll see these six gold dots around certain areas. Those are all meant to indicate the beginning of a verse. So it's basically like a beginning of each important section. And then one thing that's really cool about this particular section we're looking at is that you have this extremely elaborately decorated Kufic text in gold. So it's hard to tell, but if you look closely, you have these vegetal patterns and you have this circle medallion, but right in the middle, it is still the Kufic text in gold. And that is actually a basically bolded title for this section. It actually says the spider, which indicates it's part of this it's the title of the parable that's going to be described in the preceding part of the text. And it's essentially like a theological parable saying that people who are put their trust in figures besides Allah are like spiders who build flimsy homes. I have this close up to let you see these vegetal patterns, right? When I say vegetal, I'm referring to like organic, like plant-like patterns. And so you see this like plant-like pattern and then this Kufic gold script right in the middle. Our next object we're looking at is the Ardabil carpet. This really the thing that is astonishing about this object is how massive it is. It's hard to get scale in these pictures that we're seeing, but these are absolutely massive carpets that were designed to be covering essentially the entire floor of a space within a mosque. So let's talk about that. Uh, excuse me, the carpet that we're looking at, there's actually two of them. They were both damaged during an earthquake, and in order to repair the larger one, they took elements of the smaller one. And then they still like fix the smaller one too, but the larger one reflects what the size originally would have looked like, and then the smaller one um, is uh, is smaller because they use elements of it. And the smaller one's actually in the US. It's at LACMA in California, and the other one is the V&A in England. This originally was designed as a matching pair of carpets that was supposed to be that was originally in a mosque for Safiya al-Din Ardabili. That's where the Ardabil name comes from. This is a Sufi leader, and he eventually, his descendants established the Safavid dynasty, which is like a very important dynasty, like one of the important Islamic dynasties in the Middle East. So the carpets again were damaged. So we have like these twin carpets, but one of them is smaller. It's absolutely massive. It's almost 35 feet long. So if you can imagine that, that is just absolutely massive in size and scale. But not only is it so massive, but it very intricately designed. These type of carpets, which there's a lot of Islamic carpets that were made and highly technical, lots of skill, lots of labor went into making these. This is a very common luxury object, not just for people in the Middle East and in Western and Central Asia, but became objects that they would also create and send to places like in Europe, because it was just so highly prized as being this luxury object. A These carpets, these ones in particular, are so intricately designed that each square inch of the carpet has over 340 knots in order to, in be in that encased, right? Like encased in that space. An average carpet has about 120. And so when you think about, I guess like the best comparison I can make is if you think about like a TV or if you think about something like that, a lot of times the sharpness of the clarity of what you're seeing on your TV is measured by the pixels. And the more pixels you have, the sharper the image is. And the less pixels you have, the less sharp the image is. So this is an example of like a very high pixelated screen. Like there's just so many knots in it that it just makes this extremely luxurious and richly designed carpet. The center medallion that you see has been, scholars have interpreted this to reflect that it's supposed to reflect the design of the dome that would have been in the mosque. And part of the reason they support that is because the design is fairly similar to what the dome of the mosque would have looked like, but you also see these two elements extending up and down that look like the mosque lamps that would have been hanging from the dome. So it almost been this like reflective thing of like the dome and the lamps hanging down, and then the carpet would have reflected that like a pool of water almost or something. It according to our records that we know, there probably would have been about 10 people, 10 men working on this, which, was such an important task that they would have had a lot of people working on it. And there's actually an inscription that you can see at the very top of the image that I have here that says, "Except for thy threshold, there is no refuge for me in all the world. Except for the door, there is no resting place for my head. The work of the slave of the portal, Maksud Kashani." So this is a reference to one of the people that helped to make this carpet, and essentially a reference to the space, the mosque itself. So the idea is that the door that is being represented is meant to represent the royal court, and that essentially like this area that this carpet would have been in, that there's no rest in this world, there's no refuge except for a person being in this holy space. That's sort of what they're trying to say here. These are two images to give you a sense of what the carpets look like now after they've been after the big one has been reconstructed using the small one, basically. So you have the Lakme carpet and the V&A carpet, the V&A being the larger one. And this shows you what the shrine, where these carpets originally would have been located, that showing you how large and how much space this would have covered in its when it was originally in this mosque. Here's a close-up of the inscription. That was the text that I just read you, just to give you a sense again of this calligraphy that would have been included. All right, here's our next object. So this is going to be a little bit of an exception to what we've been looking at so far when we've been talking about Islamic art and architecture. I've emphasized over and over again this idea that we don't have a ton of imagery or figures. This is obviously an exception to that rule, and that's because we're looking at an image that is meant to describe something that doesn't necessarily have like religious it's not related to a religious narrative. The picture that we're looking at, this is known as the Court of the Gayumars. This is Safavid origin, so Safavid being the dynasty related to the Ardabil carpet, which we just talked about. And this is from a book known as the Shahnameh, I believe it's how it's, or Shahnameh. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. But this is the Book of the Kings. This was produced by Shah Tahmasp. So Shah basically being like a king. And this is an image that is part of like a history book of kings and is meant to describe this specific story of the Gayumars. So there's an inscription here I'm going to read, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. So, when the sun shined from the Lamb constellation to rejuvenate the living beings entirely, it was then when Gayumars became the king of the world. He first built his residence in the mountains. His prosperity and his palace rose from the mountains, and he and his people wore leopard pelts. Cultivation began from him, and the garments and food were ample and fresh. So the text is clearly telling us about the rise and power of this figure Gayumar. Then the people that he rules are the Gayumars. And the idea here is that he was a very beloved Persian king. And if you look at the images, and I have some close-ups we'll look at on the next couple of slides, you'll notice that there is an emphasis on several things that are mentioned in this text, in the inscription, which is this idea of peace, prosperity, cultivation, this idea that him being in power created a really positive, great time, basically, for the people. So let's look at some close-ups. Here is a close-up. You'll notice that, if you look at this other image, there's clearly a center figure, and that's Gayumar himself. But if you look at the lower part, there's this like half circle ring of aristocrats, people, the Gayumars themselves that are centering around, and they are all dressed in leopard pelts there, which are these luxury objects. They all look quite peaceful. There's many animals and overflowing foliage. So this idea that the animals and the foliage are signifies prosperity, and that the animals themselves are all living in harmony. I mean, you literally see these tigers next to the deer and animals that typically would be at odds in the animal kingdom, right? Like animals that would be eating one another, but even the animals are tame. So this implication that he's taming the wild, that, they're overflowing with resources, that it's just fully an example of peace. Here's some close-ups to show Gayumar himself. He is dressed in this leopard skin. He is quite peaceful looking. He has this expression of calmness and a little bit of a smile. So, giving the sense of peace and harmony and joy, like all of those things are being conveyed here. We haven't talked about Chinese art yet, but this image is highly influenced by Chinese art, despite the fact that this is an Islamic leader. But again, this is central parts of Central Asia. So, the fact that we have both of these influences like makes a lot of sense. You'll notice that the clouds in the sky are, I mean, you might not know this because you might not know attributes of Chinese art, but this is very much influenced from Chinese art. You also have this gold background that could be Byzantine influence, but also was used a lot in Chinese art as well. So this could have also be emblematic of influences from Chinese art. So these are some of the things I've already talked about. This is from the Safavid origin. We have subject matter that is not religious in nature, so you can have figures, depiction of the Gayumars. And Gayumar was the first king of Persia. So this is this idea that this is honoring like his dynasty, like when he was in charge, when he was in power. You have the calligraphy here. Yeah, I feel like we kind of talked about all of these things. So this is a really great, beautiful example of a folio or a page from a book, highly illustrated, very technically skillful of the artist to create something like this. And it's really cool because you can see the influence from the Islamic side of in terms of seeing, we have the calligraphy, we have the inscriptions, but from a narrative perspective, because again, in Islamic art, we don't see a ton of examples of narrative, so we see influence from Asian art coming in. All right, the next structure we're going to be looking at is considered the most important architectural structure in the world for Muslims. So the image that we're looking at right now, this is an image of the Kaaba. So the Kaaba is actually relatively small, like it's not a structure that is when I say small, I mean in terms of architecture, this is not something that like people are entering and navigating. It's actually the site marking a location that becomes an important larger site for Muslims. So we talked before when we talked about Islam, we talked about this idea of Muhammad obviously being the most important prophet for Muslims. And we talked about the five pillars of Islam. So each of the five pillars of Islam are basically five things you have to do or five elements of being a Muslim that make you a good Muslim. The last and pillar of Islam is known as the Hajj. The Hajj is a pilgrimage, basically, that all able-bodied Muslims must embark and experience once in their lifetime. That's something extremely important, is that you have to make the pilgrimage or travel to Mecca, Mecca being the most important city for Muslims because this is where Muhammad was born and where Islam really developed. So the idea is that are meant to travel to Mecca and you can visit this location, the Kaaba. So the Kaaba is an extremely important site. It is the site very much associated with Muhammad, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is and sort of how this space is used. So the Kaaba here, I think, are some great images to show you how important of a space this is because you'll notice that there are literally millions of people that will come visit this every year. There's a specific week that's dedicated to this pilgrimage that people come and perform the like rituals and rites associated with the Hajj. So the Kaaba itself is a little bit over 40 feet high, so it's not massive. I mean, it's pretty big, but and it's not something meant to be navigated by people or entered in. It's really meant to be experienced like from the exterior. Again, Kaaba or Mecca, excuse me, is the most important city in Islam. It's the birthplace of Muhammad. And so the Kaaba marks the most important holy and sacred site. It's also believed that this site marks a couple other important locations. And then to add on to it, this idea of Mecca is not just a place that you're supposed to visit, but we've talked before about when you perform your prayers, which is another important pillar of Islam. You're supposed to perform your prayers 5 times a day. You're always supposed to point in the direction of Mecca when you do those prayers. So again, this is like two really important pillars of Islam directly connected to the Kaaba and to Mecca. So the tawaf is this ritual or this rite that Muslims perform where they circumnavigate or they walk around the Kaaba in this ritual that gets performed again every year during Hajj, which is done on like a particular day. There's over 1 million Muslims that come every year to visit. This is about a 5-day ritual that takes place. This site that this is located on is also believed to be so in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. All three of these major world religions have the figures of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael being these important figures. So in Islam, it's believed that Abraham and Ishmael, so in Christianity and Judaism, there's a story of Abraham being an important prophet, being asked to sacrifice his son, and God saves him at the last second. And in Christianity and Judaism, this is Abraham and Isaac. In Islam, it's believed that it was Abraham and Ishmael. And Jews and Christians believe that their descendants come from Isaac, and in Islam, Muslims believe that they come from Ishmael. So it shows that there's like these connections, but a little bit of divergences as well. It's believed that this is a site that would have taken place. This sacrifice would have taken place. And it's also believed that there is a black stone that would have been given to Abraham by the archangel Gabriel. And that black stone is actually contained in the Kaaba. And I have a close-up of it to show you what it looks like. And it's believed that Muhammad would have had possession of it when he was the prophet on the earth. So Muhammad was eventually driven out of the city of Mecca and established like a new site in Medina. But eventually the Kaaba or the Mecca was taken back by Muslims, and there's this idea that they cleanse the Kaaba of pagan idols and reclaim the Kaaba for Mecca for Muslims. The structure has to be repaired and maintained over time. It's quite different now that it would have been historically, like when, because this has been around for almost, I mean, more than 1,000 years at this point. And the space around the Kaaba, you'll notice in these pictures, has been converted into a mosque. So this entire space has been created to house this, large amount of people during this very holy pilgrimage, this important event that takes place. There's also a silk tapestry that covers the Kaaba known as the Kiswa. And this is actually replaced every single year. So any picture you see of the Kaaba, not any picture, but most pictures you see of the Kaaba, they might look slightly different. And that's because the black of the Kaaba is not painted. It's actually tapestry. It's fabric that has been inscribed often with calligraphy and designs and tessellated patterns, the kind of typical things we see in Islamic art. I have this video, which is really fantastic, that gives some great uh oh, sorry. See, even this picture, you can see right off the bat, this design looks very different from the pictures I was just showing you because, again, this tapestry is replaced every year. So this video does a good job of showing you what Hajj looks like, some of the rules around Hajj, some of the rituals around Hajj, like kind of the idea of, what explaining the Hajj to people that might not know much about it.
You might be familiar with this picture. Thousands upon thousands of people, all wearing the same clothes and gathering somewhere in Saudi Arabia. This is the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage, and here are 7 things about it that you probably didn't know. You might have seen this, the big black cube. The Kaaba is a huge stone structure that sits at the heart of the Grand Mosque, Islam's most sacred place of worship. Pilgrims circle the Kaaba counterclockwise 7 times at both the beginning and the end of Hajj. It's a ritual called tawaf. Pilgrims also typically travel back and forth between 2 hills called Safa and Marwa for also 7 times. It's not entirely clear why it's 7 specifically. but 7 is a prominent number associated with the divine in many religions, including Christianity and Judaism. It might surprise you to know that the Hajj generally has very little to do with the Prophet Muhammad. It actually commemorates the life of another prophet, Ibrahim. Yes, Abraham, who is also a key figure in both Judaism and Christianity. He was the one who rebuilt the Kaaba with his son Ismail. And Hajj rituals mostly follow the struggle of Ibrahim, his wife and son in surrendering their wills to God. We've heard a lot of debates in the West about Muslims' face veil or niqab. Well, one place where it's definitely not allowed is on the Hajj. Women are expected to cover their hair with headscarves similar to mine, but the face veil and burqa are not permitted in Hajj. You know what else? The pilgrimage industry is Saudi Arabia's second most important after oil and gas. The tourism sector contributes $22.6 billion to Saudi Arabia's economy, with Hajj providing nearly half of it. And the Hajj is really expensive. The average price of a Hajj package ranges between $4,000 up to $10,000 here in the UK. Selfies, not welcomed in Hajj. The Saudi authorities forbid taking photographs, whether with camera or a mobile phone, at some of the holy sites. Any violation of official instruction could lead to confiscation of your device. The idea is to make pilgrims focus entirely on their spiritual journey. But this is not easy to enforce when you have millions of people all keen to have a memory from the once-in-a-lifetime journey. The Hajj takes 5 days, and towards the end of it comes Eid al-Adha, or the festival of sacrifice. Muslims worldwide celebrate by slaughtering an animal, usually a sheep. This is another part of the ritual that relates to Prophet Ibrahim. It commemorates the willingness of Ibrahim to sacrifice his son Ismail as an act of obedience to God before God intervened to provide him with a ram to sacrifice instead. Finally, performing a Hajj is considered a great accomplishment for Muslims. In some cultures, people even add the title in front of their names to signify their accomplishments, so they are Haji. The Hajj absolves Muslims of past sins, so before the Hajji-to-be travels to Mecca, it's very common for people to ask their relatives, friends and acquaintances to forgive them.
All right, our next architectural structure is another one of the most important holy sites in Islam. The Mecca is certainly considered the most important holy site, but this is also a very important holy site in Islam. This is known as the Dome of the Rock. This is located in Jerusalem. The structure is absolutely beautiful. Some of the key characteristics of this site that become really synonymous with the Dome of the Rock, and really a lot of other Islamic architecture, is this really beautiful blue mosaic work that you see, lots of these geometric patterns. There's calligraphy here. You might not notice it right off the bat, but if you look at the very top of the shape that you're seeing here, you see that calligraphy all the way around with lots of geometric patterns, and then this really beautiful pure gold dome that is right on top. So very expensive materials, lots of technique here, lots of these geometries, all of these things give us a sense of like how much effort and resources were put into this, and very beautiful structure. So this is again the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is not actually a mosque. Some people think it's a mosque just because they associate mosques with Islam, but it's actually it's not a mosque in the traditional sense. It's actually meant to mark a site of importance for Islam, and that's it's believed that this was the site of the ascension of Muhammad. He basically received a vision, and this is when he was called to be prophet and began Islam as a major religion. And so it's believed that this was designating that site. It was constructed at a time where Mecca was under control, was not under control by Muslims. So they designated this area as like, okay, well, we're going to build this area, which is also extremely important to be able to have like a focal point for our religion. But then eventually they reconquered Mecca. So because it's a holy site, it's not a mosque, but it is a holy site, you will still not see any animal or human motifs, lots of geometric vegetal patterns, calligraphy, all of those things. The site of the Dome of the Rock is actually quite important, quite contested. It's basically the Dome of the Rock is on the Temple Mount, which is considered one of the most holy sites for the three major, like biggest world religions, or three of the big world religions, which are Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. It's believed in Christianity that this is the site where Abraham was sacrificed by Isaac. Or sorry, that Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, excuse me. This is believed by Muslims to be the site where Muhammad ascended to heaven on his uh, Knight's Ascension, again being called the prophet. And this is also believed by Jews to be the site where God created the world and to be the Temple Mount. And there's prophecies basically um, for Jews and for Christians, for some Christians, that this site will be important in rebuilding of a temple and everything like that. So all that to say, it's a very highly contested place. Um, it's more complicated than this, but there are obviously a lot of political tensions and tensions in this area of the Middle East. And some of it can be drawn from religious influence. But of course, it's much, much, much more complicated than that. So just to give a sense of, the importance of this site and the fact that this has really been a contested area for a very, very long time. This also serves as a pilgrimage site similar to Mecca, but it's not something that is required in your lifetime the same way that the Hajj is. But you also carry out acts like of the tawaf, of this circumambulating, like circling the space, as like a ritual act, basically. You'll also notice that the space in the interior is quite different because, as I mentioned before, this is not a mosque in a traditional sense, because it's not meant to be like a place of worship. It really is a site where they have preserved the existing rock there. There's not like, cement flooring or any sort of flooring there. It's really just the rock because it's meant to preserve that spot where Muhammad himself, his feet would have been. There's actually a belief that there's a I tried to include it here, but it's hard to find a close-up image. But it's believed that the foot of the Prophet Muhammad was actually incised into the rock when he came down from heaven. This is a couple of more pictures. Well, this is the top picture is a picture of the interior of the Dome of the Rock. The bottom is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a church that's also located on the Temple Mount, so like near the Dome of the Rock, basically. And it's a Christian site, and it's believed to be where Christ was buried and resurrected for Christians. And so when Muslims were building the Dome of the Rock, it was believed that they were sort of trying to outshine the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because again, this was like a contested area and there's a lot of fighting between the Christians and the Muslims at this time. Um, so the lot of the calligraphy that exists on the walls give us a really good sense of early Quranic passages as they originally would have been written and understood, because of course over time, like texts like these things vary a little bit. And it's also believed to be one of the first buildings that Quranic texts would have been integrated as calligraphy. So again, establishing this really important precedent of having calligraphy on architecture. Another thing that is important to point out is you'll notice the alternating colors of the arches, which are reminiscent of the voussoirs that we saw when we were looking at Spain. So this becomes also very characteristic of Islamic architecture. And if you look at the exterior of the building, there's columns. There's specifically Roman columns that are included. And this is another example of spolia. We've talked about this word before, where you take elements from pre-existing buildings and incorporate them as a way to show, power over that civilization that you have like conquered basically. Because remember, when we talk about these Roman ruins, we're really talking about Christian Romans that they were trying to show power over. All right, I want to do a quick refresher on our mosque terms because we're going to look at like a more official mosque on the next slide, and I want to make sure that we remember some of the important elements that characterize a mosque. So if you'll remember, we've talked about a courtyard is often a part of a mosque structure, some sort of space that allows light in and is outdoors essentially. Often when we see mosques, we have minarets. This is where prayers are called. So it has to be some sort of tower because that allows for voice projection and to be able to call people to prayer. Mihrabs are often on Qibla walls. A mihrab is normally a niche that is carved into a wall of the Qibla wall, which faces in the direction towards Mecca to let you know where to pray. Because when you do your prayers every day, your 5 prayers a day, you know which direction to face. And then minbars are also quite common, and minbars are where there are the equivalents of priests who give like speak to the congregants essentially in this location. So the mosque we're going to look at here is known as the Great Mosque, the Masjid-e-Jama Isfahan, or Friday Mosque. The Friday Mosque it was built on the site of a smaller mosque, but has expanded over time to become this extremely large complex and really one of the most spectacular examples of mosque structures in the Middle East, and this is located in Isfahan, Iran. So this was really outfitted to house a lot of people and has been changed over time all the way into the 20th century to fit the needs of the community. The structure itself, if you look at the very bottom left, you see this design of what this complex looks like, and really it's a little bit complicated because it's actually this large mosque, but the very center of it is the courtyard, and then you have these large domes and 4 entrances that all face each other like this into the mosque structure. So it's interesting because it doesn't really have like a centralized mosque structure. It's really the courtyards in the middle, and then the mosque is on the outside. And then on the outside of that mosque structure, over time, those areas have become bigger and bigger and bigger, and are basically like markets and public buildings that have been added to make this like almost like a mall a little bit, if you think about like these connected spaces, but like with the central part being this holy space. And it's interesting too because you have these markets and these things connected, which really are like the out exterior of the city. It's like where it's like hustling and bustling. But once you get to the mosque structure and into the courtyard structure, you're really blocked off from the rest of the world. And it's quite a bit quieter in this area, meant to be more contained and peaceful. So a lot of large cities have congregational mosques, so mosques that were meant to be for like a big community. So this is an example of that. It's meant to be able to be how like house a lot of people at once. And then again, we have these markets and large access roads to get into it. And it makes sense too because you really have 4 entrances into these spaces. And anytime you have like multiple entrances into a place, that probably indicates that you have a lot of people going into it, right? Because you have a lot of opportunity for people like to go in as opposed to just like one entryway that you have to like everybody has to wait. So we have this huge courtyard or sawn right in the middle. You're isolated from the noise, and you have a 2-story arcade, so it's fairly large in terms of like what's protecting the interior courtyard area. And you have actually 4 iwans, which are these large arched doorways, which are, basically show you what direction to go into the mosque, and they're all centrally placed towards the interior of the courtyard. We have 2 of the Iwans are very, very decorated, and most all of them have the mukarnas carved into them, which we'll look at some close-ups of that in just a minute. And the largest one that we have, you can see in this image here, this largest, most decorated Iwan has 2 really large minarets attached to it, which again are these places for calls to prayer. And they point towards Mecca. So this is known as like a Qibla Iwan, so it's pointing you in the direction towards Mecca. Um, we believe it's the first mosque that would have had this construction, this 4E1 construction, but we do have examples of other structures that have followed this type of design since then. And the bottom right image, we have the minbar and a mihrab showing you that the interior of the space has the elements of a typical mosque as well. I have this great video that shows you some of the interior and show you like the designs of these things, which are really cool. And then you'll notice too in these pictures that you can see these mukarnas. These are sort of bigger mukarnas, these like niches that have been carved out to look almost like a cave or something. Really, really fantastic structure.
This mosque, with its elaborate decorative flourishes, encapsulates the beauty of Persian architecture. Paragon of Persian architecture, Masjid-e-Jame of Isfahan. In the 17th century, Isfahan enjoyed a golden age as the capital of the kings of Persia. Passing through its famous bazaar, filled with countless stalls, brings us to the entrance to the Friday Mosque. The Friday Mosque gets its name because it is the area's major center for Muslim Friday prayers. This is the oldest standing mosque in Iran, first built in the 8th century. Construction continued for 1,000 years, turning it into an embodiment of Persian architecture. The iconic feature of the mosque is its enormous arched, open-sided rooms called Iwan. There are 4 of them on the north, south, east and west sides of the mosque. The way these Iwan face each other creates an elegant architectural composition. Inside the mosque, there are numerous prayer halls dating from many eras. The oldest is this one, made of brick, which goes back to the 11th century. All of the arches and ceiling domes were constructed using unmortared brick. Down through the ages, the prayer halls became more and more ornate. This is a mihrab, which indicates the direction of Mecca. Its intricate design, executed in plaster relief, makes it one of the great artistic treasures of Iran. Next to this carefully preserved ancient prayer hall is one where worshippers pray to Allah each day. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when Persian arts were at their zenith, the Iwan were given elaborate decoration. Their walls are covered by sumptuous, intricate designs. The tile work completely covers the walls. Each bit was hand-shaped by artisans using hammers and then assembled piece by piece. These geometric floral patterns are called arabesques. And this is calligraphy in the Arabic script. Persian art developed on these lines because of the Islamic prohibition on icons and idol worship. The decoration of the Iwan is meant to remind the faithful of eternal paradise. After 1,200 years, the Friday Mosque still stands, a dazzling monument that echoes with prayers of the faithful.
All right, now we're going to look at our last architectural structure for this section. This is probably one of the most famous architectural structures in the world. This is the Taj Mahal located in Agra, India. Um, it's interesting because what we're looking at is not actually an Islamic structure in the sense that it's not a mosque, but it's a mausoleum, it's a burial site basically. But we see a lot of elements of Islamic architecture and art. And the person who built this was Islamic, so there's lots of incorporations of things referencing Islam. So we're going to put in the category of Islamic architecture in the sense that it served the purposes of an Islamic ruler, but it's not a mosque. Like it's not an actual site for dedicated just to like worship or something like that. So this structure was built by Oh, there we go. Here's the location just to give you a sense of where we are. So this is Agra, which is near New Delhi in India. So this was commissioned by Shah Jahan, who was the leader of this area at the time. He was Muslim, and he built this in as a dedication to Mumtaz Mahal, who was one of his wives, his most precious wife, who died in childbirth. And this was really a demonstration of power, courtly splendor, and expression of religious power too, and as a way to design a paradise on earth. And this is also where he eventually was buried as well. So it was originally dedicated to his wife, but it was also meant to be a burial site for him as well. So this area in Agra was right on a river, and it was really regarded as this riverfront garden city. So this area that was flourishing, was quite prosperous, and the idea of water was seen as highly related to paradise, and heaven for Muslims. So there's a big through line of that idea in this structure, and we'll talk about that. We have lots of, so the entire complex of the Taj Mahal is not just this Taj Mahal building, this white mausoleum that we see, but a whole complex with gardens, waterways, multiple other buildings on this site, and it's this entire complex. On the next slide, I'll show you the design to give you a sense of that. But the entire thing was meant to be reminiscent of this idea of heaven as described in the Quran. So lots of water, lots of vegetation, and this white structure here. All of these things were meant to connote paradise, essentially. The interior plan has a repetition a lot of the number eight. There's a lot of reference to the number eight, specifically lots of inclusions of octagons, like an octagonal shape, which is eight-sided. And all of this is meant to, again, be a reference to paradise. There's a connection in the Quran between the number eight and paradise, that there's these like levels, basically. So the entire complex, again, is meant to be a mausoleum, a burial site. And the picture I have here on the bottom that I covered up with this map, but you can probably see on the slideshow yourself, is showing the burial, the tombs essentially of the Shah and his wife. And these are meant to show where they're buried. They're technically not even buried here. They're buried a little bit below. It was meant to like kind of throw people off, specifically like if they were ever like invaded or raided or something like that. But these were meant like more of like the ceremonial burial sites with their actual burial in a room underneath. So we have lots of white marble being used here, which would have been really rare and hard to obtain, so very luxurious. This white was meant to represent purity. It's very unusual to have things built with this level of marble and this level of like cleanliness. And it's actually, from what I've read, extremely difficult to maintain. It's really hard to maintain this like white marble color. It has to be cleaned a lot to be able to maintain it. Um, there's also a lot of red stonework, and I'll show you in the next couple of slides what I mean by that. But there's a couple of constructions that have red stone, which typically it's that the material used for the red stone was a lot more accessible, so it's easier to build things like that. But also, normally were used for functional buildings like forts and military buildings, and symbolize the warrior class. However, the two buildings that we have here, one of them is actually a mosque, so we're seeing like an unusual use of the red for a religious site. Here is a couple of examples to give you a sense of the floor plan. You'll notice that we have several elements of Islamic architecture. We see minarets being included here. We have iwans, which are these big, sort of decorative, beautiful archways leading into the interior. We also have the inclusion of a dome, which was reminiscent of what we saw in the Dome of the Rock, which also was reminiscent of Byzantine architecture, which was reminiscent of Roman architecture. Here we see a little bit of a difference. We have like an onion-shaped dome, which is a little bit different, and this has connections to like structures that are in Asia. So it's kind of showing this dual influence here. And then this middle image here shows the entire structure of the design of the entire Taj Mahal complex. Because again, it's not just the Taj Mahal, it's this entire area of gardens and waterways and, meant to be this beautiful site with lots of order and symmetry being included here. Lots of floral and geometric motifs throughout, and then the minarets frame the complex. This is a picture of the like backside of it, of the Taj Mahal, and I wanted to show this because it shows you that this is right on the riverfront. And then you have, so you have the river, you have this elevated area with the Taj Mahal in the middle, and then these red structures on either side with the one on, I believe it's the one on the left image here being the mosque. I'm not 100% sure about that. But you have a mosque structure, and then the entire part in front of that would have been the garden area and the waterways and everything like that. So another image to show you like a bird's eye view of this entire complex. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is a close-up of this entryway. You'll notice a lot of things we've seen in Islamic architecture, right? So we have this huge Iwan, these huge like niches basically for the entryways. You have these vegetal patterns, and you'll also notice a huge calligraphic design framing the Iwan. So you have all of this calligraphy framing the Iwan right there, and all of this is Quranic text, so text from the Quran, scriptural text, all referencing paradise, resurrection, the power of Allah, all of the things that you might typically think that would be associated with this mausoleum structure. So thanks.